We gaan beginnen.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Great to see many familiar names in the participants list. It's good to see you back. Great you're here. I see a couple more people dropping in. That's cool. Yeah, so scaling. Yes, good morning, Giuliano. Scaling is kind of a subject that pops up in every training, every discussion, every organization we come to and try to help them with product management. Scaling is one of the top questions that always pops up. So we thought this is a good topic to talk about.
Yeah, and a couple of folks here mentioned it as well to do some talks and spend some time on it. So let's dive into the first part on scaling in this episode.
Yeah, you can advance to the next slide.
Yeah, let's kick off with this one.
Yeah, you know the drill. So open up the chat box and chat window and think about scaling. What about it? What best reflects scaling? What scaling is about? Is that picture A, picture B, or picture C? I see a couple of C's. I see some B's. At least one person is not lying because I've been in A's many times.
Nigel has joined us too often. He knows the drill.
Yeah.
In theory or practice? Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. It's a good inlining. None of them, all of them.
All right. Yeah, so it kind of depends on what you see in the pictures, right?
So what do you see in the pictures, Robin?
Yeah, well, I think looking at picture A, the thought that came up to me when looking at these pictures is that basically a lot of people think that all these different scaling frameworks will help you to solve a lot of organizational problems, right? And like we see with this major traffic jam on this crossroads, well, that seems to be a rather complex problem. So how about a scaling framework to solve it? On the other hand, when dealing with all those scaling frameworks, we're trying to, in a lot of cases, add complex solutions for those complex problems. And if you look at what we would like scaling to be more about, is maybe it's more about scaling down rather than actually scaling up. And it's maybe much more about simplicity or adding simplicity to a complex organization rather than adding more complexity to an already complex organization. So although you may have had some other ideas when taking a look at these pictures, these were the thoughts that popped up to us when searching for them. And maybe before we go into the actual content, this has been a topic that quite a couple of people have requested over time to talk about. So what is it that you would like to talk about or learn about, or what you would like us to talk about when it comes to scaling? What is some stuff that we need to discuss? Maybe not necessarily in this episode. We'll see if we can get to that. But maybe we can pick up some specific scaling topics in future episodes.
Culture topologies. Yeah. Communication. How do we know we're still adding value? That's a very good question.
All right, great questions coming in. So just keep adding them throughout the session, and we'll see if we can answer some of them along the way, and otherwise we'll see if we can discuss them in one of the separate next value stream sessions. So let's go into to the introductions of scaling. And when we talk about this concept of scaling, you could say that there's a couple of different ways to talk about scaling in itself. And there's a couple of different interpretations for this topic. For example, one of the ways to look at scaling is to consider the scaling of a team. So in this specific context, basically scaling refers to the expansion of a team by adding more people, or the expansion of an organization by adding more people and then adding more teams. And you can think of a Scrum team. At some point in time, you may end up with 10 people, or you want to hire even more. And it may be a good time to actually split that team into a couple of smaller teams. So you could start talking a bit about scaling, since we're going to work with multiple teams. However, likely these two teams can still work with the same product owner or product manager. Another way to talk about scaling is to look at it from a product perspective. So in this case, we're actually going to scale the product for future growth, or try to grow the product in itself. For example, we do this a lot by doing additional investments, trying to build new features or expand the product or add new technologies, or basically all the stuff that you guys do, and girls, of course, on a daily basis, and trying to make your product better in order to deliver more value or to acquire more revenues for the organization in the end. And there's a couple of different perspectives when it comes to scaling that product. And you can talk about growing a product. And when we talk about growing a product, it is typically investing some money in order to get some value in return. And when you really start talking about scaling a product, what we then tend to see is that we invest some money so that the product can continue to grow on its own. And that's when you basically move into scaling. And that's something that you see with a lot of software as a service products, for example. They scale really well, and we don't need a lot of additional investments in order for that product to scale on a longer term, or even exponentially scale maybe. And of course, another perspective to look at when it comes to scaling is to scale a process, or maybe scale the way of working. And in this case, we may start talking about agile scaling frameworks, like Safe, Nexus, Less, and those kinds of frameworks. And then it's more about basically aligning all people, like we see here with these military folks, aligning all noses in the same direction, working in the same way, having the same structures, communications, etc. And that's another interesting perspective.
I think that answers Andrea's question on about people and interactions and processes and tools.
Yeah.
But Robin, do you often see that people confuse the word scaling in a certain context? That they talk about team scaling where others are talking about process scaling, or for example, is that something we see a lot?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of different interpretations indeed. So when I guess most agile folks start talking about scaling, they tend to refer to the way of working. So to those frameworks that we mentioned before. When most managers start talking about scaling, they start to refer to stuff like cross-silo alignment of people, processes, and product, and making sure that all noses are in the same direction and they're looking for that silver bullet in the form of a scaling framework. And seek a solution for everybody to work on the same stuff, etc.
Field manual.
Sorry?
Field manual.
Yeah, exactly. And then we go to the product managers or product owners, and they should actually start to refer to this value that the product creates and scaling of the actual product or growth of the actual product. So it's kind of interesting that if, as product people, we tend to care most about scaling a product, then what makes these different scaling frameworks so interesting? Stuff like Safe, Less, Nexus, Spotify model. Why do a lot of product people care so much about these frameworks? And it may be some interesting thing to, again, share in the chat. Maybe share some of your perspectives. Think about this question for a moment. Why are these so interesting for us as product people? Instead of, for example, stuff like this. Maybe there's some frameworks for scaling your product as well, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting because, of course, we're simply dumbing the story a little bit down. But oh, that was too dumb. like, but the point is, we are using different perspectives to look at the topic of scaling. And one of the things when you look at this product scaling, you could look at things like this. And on the left picture, for those of you who are old enough to remember it, this is Microsoft Office 1.0. So the first time that Microsoft actually bundled Excel, Word, and come on, was the first, a PowerPoint together. And it was 1992 as a response to each of the individual products being attacked in a market by different competitors. So you had WordPerfect attacking Word. You had, I think it was Multiplan or Lotus that attacked Excel. And rather than having to compete on all the different fronts, they bundled them together and gave the customer more value for money. And therefore no reason to switch. You already had Word, okay, you preferred Excel, so why buy WordPerfect? You already have a word processor. So there's a good idea to scale the value of your product. It only works if the products are sort of in a saturated market and are good enough compared to the competition. The funny thing is, a couple of years later, EasyEd was founded and did the exact opposite thing. So they took something that was really complex, and it was an inherent bundle of services, like getting your ticket, like getting your luggage, getting a meal on the plane, getting a flight, getting all kind of services around air travel, and they unbundled it. They pulled it apart and say, well, maybe people don't want all these options. But I'm not sure if they actually organized themselves in that way. But you could see how each of these elements became separate products. And now I can outsource my catering to a separate product team, or even a separate outside my company, because it's no longer my core product. It's a great way to unbundle. Another couple of things that we've seen is, for example, I have a background at TomTom where we started it in 2004 with one device. And you may remember this iconic little box you had on your dashboard, and then you made a turn and the thing went out of the window, because the suction naps, we didn't have invented that until the second or third edition, I guess. And it was 2008 and we had 24 different product variants. Why did we have 24 different variants? Well, because we were active in a lot of different markets and we needed to scale. Each of the products had their own product team. And you can see the hardware is all slightly different, the software is all slightly different, the packaging is all slightly different. It will get you into a lot of problems later on. But it allows you to scale the product. You just had an autonomous team, you were innovating, you were trying out stuff in new countries, new form factors, and allowing you to iterate really fast without adding the complexity of managing that all from a single team or to a single product base. And again, the other way around, when you look at mundane work, like, well, getting sure your advertisement ends up in the hand of the right person, there's platforming these days. And I can pick a platform. And once a platform is established, it is extremely difficult to enter that market. So think about Google or Facebook. It would be really difficult to add a new platform. And in the same time, it opens up your teams to not having to build all this complexity of figuring out to which user to show which ad. Moving on. I think there were a couple more. Yeah. This is a nice one. I recently learned about a company called Blue Wrist. They're from Canada, and they created these industrial robots. And they were having a hard time to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. And one of their new products was actually an AI-driven robot that learns what the best place is in the warehouse. And they still struggled with the word robotics until they rebranded it to, I think it was called Autonomous Automated Worker, something like that. And they pitched it to warehousing as a device that is smart and it self-learns. It figures out which stuff will be shipped on Thursday and moves in on Wednesday night. It starts moving that to the front of the warehouse. If it encounters an obstacle, it will find a new route. If it finds an obstacle more frequently, it will make that route more permanent. So it's really like an autonomous worker. And they moved out of this big industrial robot industry space into something that's far more profitable. And the other one that you can think about is channels. So you could also scale your product by absorbing more of your channel. Typically, you build something and then you have distributors and sailors and then retailers. There's a whole chain of things, but you could also kind of eat the chain and go directly to the consumer. And Picnic is a great example in the Netherlands, where they completely bypass the distributors, the wholesalers, the retailers, and go directly to the consumer for our benefit, but also for theirs, of course. And it's not a particularly new idea. For those of you familiar with Van der Valk hotel chain, has been doing this for a couple of decades now, being very successful integrating their entire supply chain and simply getting more value from that chain. So just a couple of examples on how you could scale value creation. I started out in the naval department of Thales, building naval radars, and the big black thingy on top of that is a 3D radar that can see up into space and track objects, designed for ballistic missile defense. We had the exact same product for land-based situations because sometimes there's no ocean. And of course, that yeah, seems to happen.
Just marketing, right?
No, there were people in other departments, so we don't really know what they did. But they took our product and they created a separate product out of it. And it really changed also the properties of the product, but it changed the marketing, the way you sell it, where you sell it, and also some of the characteristics of how the thing worked. But by not trying to put everything in one radar, it became a far more flexible product, and it allowed us to scale. And the final one is, well, why not about ecosystem or technology? If you're developing for Windows or Steam or Android or Apple, those are quite different technologies. And maybe the product doesn't need to be 100% exactly the same for each of the products. So maybe you actually want to take advantage of some of the technology that Microsoft has and some of the technology that Apple has to make it feel more integrated in that environment. Does it really need to be one product owner, one team, or can it be two?
Yeah, and so basically we started with this question. So why don't we talk too much about these frameworks, like bundling, unbundling, variants, and the other ones that Chris just mentioned? Why don't we talk more about these ones instead of stuff like less, safe, nexus, etc.? And I guess it kind of makes sense if I look at the comment that I think it was Jude just made. It's a bit about creating strategic alignment across different parts of the organization, across all those different teams. And I guess that makes sense. Why do we talk so much about this stuff? Well, basically, because we're part of these large, big organizations, right? And we need to figure out some kind of a structure to at least collaborate in the same strategic indeed direction, or maybe even to some extent the tactical direction. And maybe we can leave the details up to the teams indeed, but some alignment would be useful. And perhaps it's because we're trying to deal with so much complexity in our organizations again. And again, we're trying to solve those typically by adding really complex structures instead of adding more simple structures. And your organization wouldn't be the first to basically mention these kinds of problems. There's so many dependencies within our teams or across our teams and or across our departments. So we need some kind of a scaling framework for that. Or our teams are really dependent on the expert knowledge of our product owners. So basically we need a product owner for every team because those teams depend on that knowledge. But our product owners are not aligned on the vision, the strategy, roadmap, and product backlog, for example. Or another one we hear quite a lot is it takes a really long time to make and communicate decisions here. But the question really is a framework like, as an example, SAFe or the Spotify model, is that going to solve this issue of too many dependencies? Is alignment between those teams or communication between those teams, is that going to solve all those dependencies? Or is the actual solving of the dependencies and eliminating those, is that a thing that will really help us most? And so is it the adding of a complex solution like a scaling framework that brings everybody together? Is that the best way to deal with it? Or can we actually make stuff simpler? And in that case, it's One of these things that your organization could think about is this famous sentence by Thomas John Barnardo, who once said that there can be only one captain to a ship. And maybe that also makes sense for products. So maybe it makes sense to have one person steer a product to product market fit. Maybe it makes sense if one person helps us to sail towards that island of value. And maybe it helps if one person helps us to navigate a product to success. So instead of adding more complexity to the organization, could you maybe start with reducing some complexity? And there's actually a couple of things that you as a product owner could do, or maybe you as a Scrum Master can help your product owner with. And at least one of them is try to define and communicate a clear product goal. Just start with that, schedule a meeting for today to, with your team, maybe with a couple of stakeholders, come up with a clear product goal. And perhaps that product goal is about scaling of your product. And maybe it has something to do with that bundling or unbundling or one of the other strategies. Another thing you might be able to do is with your Scrum team, identify potential knowledge and skill gaps. And based on those knowledge and skill gaps, try to create some kind of a roadmap towards more self-organization. So what is it that, for example, your Scrum team still needs to learn about your product or the domain or the market or your customers? And how can you transfer your knowledge of that product to them? Or maybe how can you connect your developers directly to customers or directly to stakeholders or people in the business part of the organization so that they can just share all that knowledge together? And as a product owner, you can basically step back a little bit and try to focus more on vision, strategy, and alignment with other products.
Maybe Andreas mentioned in the chat John Boyd. Maybe I got the story wrong, but I think Boyd was in the military, and one of the things that he did is when he looked at the product, which was the fighter plane, and I think it was Korea or Vietnam, I don't remember anymore. But anyway, the US were in trouble because the Russian planes were technically better. And what Boyd did is figure out in which combat situations they would have an advantage, like in being able to pull more Gs or atmospheric conditions or altitude, I don't remember. And then he maneuvered the battles into a situation where they would have the advantage despite having a inferior product. And that's typically, that's at least that's sprung to my mind. That would be a great example of identifying skill gaps in your team. Often we have the best engineers in our teams, and we try to add better engineers to make the product technologically more superior. But you could, and I've seen this in several occasions, benefit greatly from having more product management skills or analytics skills, or people who can do the translation and say, look, we can't go into this market. We should go in this market because we have a better chance of winning. Those are typical skills we don't see in product teams, and it would help you so much as a product owner if you would focus on those kind of skills. Sorry for the interruption.
No, definitely a great addition. I mean, that's what the second point was all about. That knowledge and skill gaps, those tend to refer to that product management knowledge that you have as a product owner, or that exists in parts of the organization. And try to include that and bring that into your team. That will help them to be more self-organizing, allowing you to focus on other stuff. So that's a good addition, I think. Yeah. And maybe another thing you can basically do today is try to identify one of the scaling challenges that you may be facing in your company. Share it in the Xebia Academy community. And maybe all these people joining this session, they know what we've talked about today. And maybe you can share some experiences. And of course, we're part of that community as well. So if we can help you out with some questions that you struggle with, we'd be happy to do so. And maybe we can pick it up in one of the future episodes of the value stream. Actually, next week, there will be a Ask Me Anything session. So we don't have a topic prepared, but we'll address any questions that you folks have. So maybe that would be a great moment to also share that question. So basically, summarizing this episode, scaling in a lot of cases is actually about scaling down, or maybe about simplifying instead of adding complexity. And for us as product people, maybe we should first focus on, hey, how do we want to scale the product? And then maybe start thinking about how do we scale our teams, or does it make sense to scale our teams up or down? And if so, what kind of framework do we need for that? And then we come to all these different frameworks, and we'll, based on the questions that you will share with us, we might pick out some of these frameworks and explain some highlights to you in the next episode. Or maybe we'll pick a cross-framework cutting topic and start thinking about that. So let us know what you want to see in the next episodes around this topic of scaling. And then there's, of course, a bunch of interesting stuff that you can read. For example, around scaling product strategy, why basically most frameworks are a fad that will eventually blow over, and how you can basically scale Scrum to the limit without maybe using all those frameworks. So there's a couple of interesting articles for you to read as well. All right.
Yeah.
So that brings us to basically the end of today's session, Chris.
Yeah. I forgot to put on my my polo. I see you are wearing your value stream polo.
Of course.
Yeah. So basically, we love to give stuff to the community, and if you're a fan of the show, you can get a goodie bag. We have some books and we have some apparel, by the way. Yeah. So there's a goodie bag, and if you come to one of our trainings, you can get one of those. But I think it runs only, I can't see it. It's limited offer. I think it runs to March. So be quick about it. And otherwise, we'll see you next week. Ask Me Anything.
Indeed. So thank you very much for joining, and see you next week.
Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode, move on to the next one. Or
join us or follow us on Medium and LinkedIn to get inspired with even more content.
Or come to our training.